Lift this up a bit. Thank you for the introduction, Lizzie. We can go to the next slide. During the Great Migration, nearly 175,000 African Americans moved to Harlem, transforming it into a cultural and intellectual hub by the early 20th century. Harlem attracted influential figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, and Louis Armstrong, as well as everyday Black residents. Next slide. In the 1950s, the city began to undertake massive urban renewal projects that removed large swaths of housing and dense development for the construction of NYCHA housing. Next slide. Other proposed projects, like the Harlem Expressway, threatened to destroy Harlem's urban fabric and uproot its residents. Next slide. And racist city policies of disinvestment and turning a blind eye to criminal neglect by absentee landlords led to a declining housing stock in Harlem and other Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Next slide. At the same time, international, national, and local and social political movements like the Civil Rights Movement, anti-Vietnam War protest, next slide, the Black Panther Party, next slide, and the Young Lords were inspiring people to take action. In the case of some architects and planners, this political, economic, and social context encouraged them to reconsider their methods of practice. Next slide. C. Richard Hatch was one of those architects. In his book, The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Brian Goldstein, who is with us today, wrote about Arch's founding. Goldstein says, Hatch and the Architects Renewal Committee in Harlem, otherwise known as Arch, tapped into broader currents emerging in Harlem and nationally in the mid-1960s. Residents subject to disruptive redevelopment plans sought the assistance of professionals who could support their activism with design expertise. Likewise, architects and planners like Hatch, who voiced a rejection of the top-down approach of modernist redevelopment from within the profession, sought opportunities to lend their expertise to the communities that Renewal reshaped. Next slide. J. Max Bond Jr., the namesake of the Bond Center and former dean of the School of Architecture here at City College, became the director of Arch in 1967, before forming Bond Writer Associates, which merged with Davis, Brody, and Associates in the 1990s to become Davis, Brody, Bond. Under Bond's tenure, Arch further emphasized community control over future development. Next slide. One project completed under Bond's direction was the East Harlem Triangle Plan, which sought not only physical change for existing residents, but economic and social change as well. The process of community engagement and visioning, as well as the emphasis on resident decision-making, marked a huge shift in planning practices. Next slide. Here you see a concept plan that emphasizes economic development in a vehicle-free residential area with educational, cultural, and social services located at its heart. Next slide. Housing is the primary focus and is integrated into the other programmatic elements. Next slide. And here is the final formal plan, which breaks from the existing fabric and massing scale of Harlem. Next slide. While the social elements were of great importance, Arch did not abandon great design as a goal, as Arch wrote in the final report, by encouraging outstanding architectural and physical design, they hope to make the community an aesthetic as well as social and economic model of dynamic, meaningful change. Next slide. In 1968, Whitney Young gave a speech at the AIA National Convention, condemning the architectural profession for its complacency and role in racist and its role in segregation and racist urban renewal projects. This speech, along with the work of Arch and other young socially conscious firms of the time, inspired others across the country to start community design centers and nonprofit design organizations. Next slide. This included the Real Great Society in East Harlem, formed by Harry Quintana, and 2MJQ in Washington, D.C., formed by Melvin Mitchell, another one of our guests today. Community design centers have continued to operate across the country, evolving to adjust to changing political and funding landscapes. Next slide. In the late 1970s and 80s, a reduction in federal funding led to a decline in community design centers, who had relied heavily on funding from HUD and other government agencies. In the late 90s and 2000s, new federal programs to encourage university partnerships and educational initiatives led to the founding of multiple new university-based design centers. Next slide. Despite a more diversified funding stream, with funding not only coming from government sources, but private philanthropy and traditional fee-for-service contracts, in recent years, some nonprofit design organizations have struggled to make the financial model work. In New York, the impact of this struggle was felt by the recent closing of Hester Street, an important design organization that has been around for 20 years. Next slide. Today, we're excited to welcome this panel to discuss the role of community design in Harlem, past and present, the relevance of the nonprofit community design center model, and who, if anyone, is filling the role Arch once played in Harlem today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, hi. My name is Vanessa Alicea Chuki, and I'll be moderating this next panel. I wanted to thank you, Mo, for that wonderful sort of context setting for ourselves today. So a quick introduction, a little bit about myself before we get to everything. I am an alum of the City College of New York. I graduated in 2005. I'm currently president of the Architecture Alumni Group of the Alumni Association of CCNY. I'm very proud that this event is being held here in Harlem at our alma mater. I'm really grateful to have you all here today. So today's conversation, this first panel, is going to be community design in Harlem then and now. We will have 4 esteemed panelists today who will all share their connections to this theme. We have Brian Goldstein from Swarthmore College, Wayne Benjamin, the Land Use Chair of Community Work 12, Melvin Mitchell, Bryant Mitchell Architects, and Roberta Washington Architects. If you can all come up to the front and take a seat. Okay, so we will have slides that each of the panelists have contributed that will be rotating in the background, but we're not going to, the slides that are in the background may not be exactly what they're talking about at that moment. So thank you, Brian, Wayne, Melvin, and Roberta. Wish I could see you. I wish this table was a little angled, but we'll see how this works. So today's panel, Community Design in Harlem Then and Now. We'd like you each to take 2 minutes or less to introduce yourself, and introduce yourself in the context of this theme, right? You were all invited here for a specific reason, your connection to Harlem, your connection to the Architecture Renewal Community of Harlem, or community design. So you can, I know you all wear many, many different hats and have so many things that you have done throughout your careers. So I think just sort of highlight a few that are in connection to the reason why we're here, sort of celebrating the 60 years of Arch and community design in Harlem. So I will, we can go sort of down the row, and maybe we'll start with you, Roberta, and then we'll just go down the row.
Thanks. So in my case, I was not around when Arch was at its height. Yes, I can. Okay. Hi. So I was just saying I wasn't around when Arch was at its height. I came later, and I think because I knew Max, and understood some of what his philosophies were in terms of architecture, doing for the community, and how to change a city or an area of a part of a city through design. Because I wanted to understand that, I became friends with Max, and it followed a trip to Africa where he explained to students at Columbia who were part of this trip the importance of sharing skills, you know, and the importance of being able to identify problems, not just where you are, but where others are living, and figure out a way to contribute to make it better. The first part of the program is about Arch and how it works and how people have participated in it. And I think that for me, because I came after, my story is really about what I learned from other folks who were part of Arch, and trying to place it in history. And also looking at the effect of Arch on architects like myself who followed, right? And one of them has to do with what happened in terms of design and community involvement and how it's different now than it was. Anyway, so that is my
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. Wayne?
Thank you, Vanessa, and I want to thank the Bond Center for inviting me to be a panelist. If Roberta came on the scene after Arch, I came on much after, because when Arch was at its height, I think I was in either elementary school or just going into junior high school. So it's also interesting to reflect on what was going on then and to see how it has informed architecture education and even the practice moving forward. In terms of my connection to the panel, I'm an architect planner that spent maybe half of my career doing community revitalization initiatives, both with Harlem Community Development Corporation and Curtis Archer's on another panel, we'll talk about that later, and also with Manhattan Community Board 12, which represents not Harlem, but Washington Heights and Inwood, and quite frankly, the challenges of Upper Manhattan, the challenges of communities of color do not change if you're going from one community board to the other. So looking at Harlem CDC, we worked heavily with affordable home ownership, and we were working with affordable home ownership. If you remember some of the photos of those vacant, abandoned buildings, that's what we were working with. That was the template that we were working with to bring back community. And we were working with, residential market and sales to community residents to understand that they too can be can own, part of their community, home buyer education, but also incentivizing other community and economic development initiatives. Once again, Yvonne Stennett from the Community League of the Heights will be on another panel. We worked with Cloth on initiatives. So there are a number of things that I've been involved with as Director of Residential Development at Harlem CDC that deal with the theme of community design. Closer to home with Community Board 12, I was drafted to be the chair of the Land Use Committee in 2003 and have not been allowed to retire. And working with the Bond Center's predecessor, we executed the first and to date only district-wide neighborhood planning and land use study for Washington Heights and Inwood, looking at things such as preserving neighborhood character, contextual zoning, and historic preservation. So there again, we're looking at who are the players that are working in the community design field today. And like Vanessa, I too am a graduate of the City College School of Architecture. I'm a few decades before her in 1980.
I'm Brian Goldstein. I'm an architectural and urban historian. I teach in those subjects at Swarthmore College. Thank you, Mo, for teeing my work up a little bit, I wrote the 2017 book, The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Gentrification and the Struggle Over Harlem, which is a history of the concept of community development in Harlem from the 60s to the 2000s, and in that is also a history of the life and afterlife of Arch. And we'll talk certainly about the life of Arch, and I hope our panel also can bring out some of the afterlife, because I think in ways that people don't always realize, it has reverberated, some very traceable and known, some maybe less so. My research interests are especially in the ways that architecture and planning and the design professions have intersected with the civil rights movement, the ways the civil rights movement reshaped both, and also related to that a long-term interest in the history of African-American architects. And I am writing a biography about Max Bond, which will be called If Architecture Were for People, the life and work of J. Max Bond Jr., and hopefully will be out in 2026. And certainly am excited to talk about him, although I'm sure I will also mention the other directors of Arch, who I think are also worth kind of thinking a little bit about, because it had 4 directors, actually 4.5, if you count a co-director. So we'll have time for those things, I'm sure, on our panel.
Excuse me. I'm Melvin Mitchell, and unlike many of the others on this panel, I was there at the beginning. I'm from Washington, D.C., and we basically in Washington, D.C. Proceeded to do everything that we could to follow in the Arch model, and to proliferate that.
Melvin, can you talk into the microphone?
Can I? Yes,
It should be on.
Just turn 45 degrees.
Oh, okay, excuse me. All right, okay, all right. So, couple of things. The connections, and this is what I want to talk somewhat about, the connections between Arch here in New York and Washington, D.C. Go very, very deep. As a matter of fact, everything that 125th Street has been experiencing from its inception to today is also happening in Washington, D.C. on U Street and what's called Black Broadway. But I want to focus on the question, who fills the Arch today, and also to add some speculation on what J. Max Bond would be doing today. And I might add, he would be, I think, if he were with us, he'd be a sprightly 88-year-old, probably the Dean Emeritus of the school, and that's just 4 years my senior. So I hope I've put that into some perspective for you. But I also, and we can come back to this, but I also want to say on the subject or the issue of today and what would be the Arch today, I'm going to want to delve into why I think that would continue to be the City College of New York and the Schweitzer School of Architecture, because with well, there are all sorts of precedents for that. And what I also want to do is to come back, I hope I'll have the opportunity to, is to go deeper on Max Bond, the Max that I knew from the beginning, from the time back when he was setting things up at Arch. And I was in D.C., a new graduate, and with a new young scientist wife who had an American Express credit card, which allowed me to bring to MJQ to fly us up here to sit at Max's feet and learn. So, hopefully.
Great. Thank you so much, Melvin. So first, I sort of want to talk a little bit about the context of Arch, and I'm gonna go back to you, Melvin, for this question. we want to sort of, how has the Architects Renewal Committee of Harlem shaped the practice of community design and Harlem's physical development over the years? And really here it's like, do you have a personal story you'd like to share about your, maybe that visit when you came to Arch? Just sort of it would be interesting to see because you had a very personal connection with Arch, so I'd love for you to share that.
Well, again, I want to make sure that we understand that my group, the 2MJQ, and for anybody that's curious, that was it was a riff on the modern jazz quartet, 2 M's, a J, and a Q. And the Q was Harry Quintana. Yes, that Harry Quintana who was here in New York, had a real great society. And so what we have to understand here is that by the time Hatch and Max in the transition had gotten the Arch going, they had already also, to what extent they understood or not, had nationalized or caused the nationalization of this entire, of what they were doing across the country, including the federalization of it, in which the federal government, through cities, was setting up these community design centers. Now, what I basically brought, or what we brought to the table as 2MJQ, me and Harry and the others, was the historically black college and university angle on all of this. Our goal simply was to take what Max was doing at Arch and to install it at all of the, at the time, 6 or 7 historically black college and universities that were producing architects and planners, and that's really what we were all about. And again, it's so important that we understand these connections, both between DC and New York, and the whole community design center concept and experience, and how it really was started right here with the Bond and Hatch Arch.
Great, thank you. Brian, do you want to maybe sort of share a little bit more context? I know in all of your research, perhaps there's some really interesting sort of stories on sort of what was happening during that time. Maybe you want to share some anecdotes with the audience.
Sure. I was kind of tracing the influence of the organization as kind of having 3 flavors, I guess, and I don't want to skip your question, so I guess I would just emphasize the degree to which the mid-'60s were a fertile moment of experimentation in which, of course, the social movement context was crucial, but also the federal government was willing to push money to the grassroots in a way that was fairly new, and also there was an array of foundations like the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Brothers Fund that were also giving money, and we'll talk about sustainability shortly perhaps, but those allowed people like Hatch and then his succeeding directors to experiment in ways that hadn't really been possible, and that made the kind of context for Arch possible. It made a group like that possible. One thing about Arch that I think is so important to understand is that the ideas were abstract. People should have power over their communities, architects should be involved, but the actions were very concrete in location. There was a real precision to their approach, and so we can trace specific neighborhoods like the East Harlem Triangle, West Harlem, Morningside Park area, the State Office Building site, which we'll see in panel 3, so I won't preempt that. Those allowed them to kind of build the kinds of associations that then they could draw upon, for actions. Also, groups like the Harlem Commonwealth Council, which isn't exactly as much of a dynamo as it was in past decades. HCC was a direct outgrowth of Arch. Actually, the initial people who founded it were included Richard Hatch, and the kind of move to Black Power later in the 60s brought on people like Donald Simmons, Preston Wilcox, who all had direct ties to Arch. I also want to mention, because I don't know if he's going to do it, is Ken Knuckles here yet? I don't think so. Arch started a program called Architecture in the Neighborhoods, which was a training program for young people who hadn't completed high school to get graduation equivalency degrees and then enroll in architecture schools, which, many similar things exist, maybe fewer than we'd like. But this is a legacy, again, of kind of being very tactical, and Ken was a product of that program. I hope he'll talk about that on our third panel. Maybe I'll stop there.
Curious, Roberta or Wayne, do you want to add anything, personal stories related to sort of Arch? Or we can...
I think, like I said, because I came after the fact, but because I was curious, I wanted to know, more about it and get more information about some of the things I was hearing. And like Brian, I was also interested in writing about it, and so I started writing about the collective history of Black architects in New York. And a part of that history does deal with Arch. So there's life before Arch, there's life during Arch, and then there's life after Arch. And although my participation is basically in the part after Arch, I think that being able to interview folks who were around, who were part of Arch, made it clearer to me what it must have been like. I'm imagining how exciting it must have been to be a part of Arch, to be able to participate in those kinds of projects. Like you mentioned, the training of art. What was just mentioned was this whole idea of training of architects, and that was one of the things that when I started reading about Arch, I was like most excited about, and I got to speak to Ken Simmons and to others, a couple of other folks, including Ken Knuckles. But the idea that, it's sort of a bold idea, that you should, that architecture was like too great an area to leave to people who have money, who had the possibilities of being able to produce it, and that there must be a way that Black folks can become more involved in developing their cities, their areas. And that has to do with having an understanding of what the situation is and what the problems are. And that whole program of training architects is like a very fascinating one. And the way the story was told to me is that that sometimes people who were not ever really thinking about architecture were sort of pulled off the street because they weren't doing anything else, and they came to a session or two, and they were persuaded to think about architecture. Because perhaps they weren't thinking about anything. Especially when they were told that it's possible, if you hung with us, to be taught, to have an opportunity to learn what architecture is and how you might participate in it. Now, not everybody, of course, is once you tell them what it is, there's still some folks who are not going to be excited about it. But I think they told the story in a way that made it seem like at least it was worth considering. And so the dropout factor is high. Not everyone stayed to the end. And even those, but if you stayed, you did get really more than the kind of introduction that people going to college would have gotten, right? And you got placed in an architectural firm. You were able to have meetings and talks with designers and architects about what it is that you could do that you never thought you could do. And yes, the dimensions of how many folks actually graduated from a program are not as great as they could have been, or I wish they were. But I think that this was like a way of at least saying to people in the neighborhood, architecture exists, and maybe if you haven't heard about it before, it's maybe something that you should think about, right? And the fact that they were able to raise money to send people to college is also incredible. And that they were able to place people who started off at ground zero in firms, and that it was done as a coalition of the AIA and firms who were interested in advancing the learning of and increasing the number of participants in design in Harlem itself is important. And so I think that that's like one of the, when I looked at it, I was really interested in that program. And there was one other program one other event that I was interested in, and that was the idea of electing or having appointed the first member, African American, to be on the planning commission, right? And even at that time, it seemed like, wow, it was really late to not have any black folks on the city planning commission, and for that to be taken up as a cause seemed like a really great idea, whose time had come, and to understand the theatrics that was involved to make that possible was also interesting, because it wasn't just the straight protest kind of thing that I would have thought was going to be the first crack at how to change the city planning commission. It was to work with the Real Great Society, right? So the two organizations together plotted, and it's sort of like a public relations kind of event too, but they plotted how to get the city to change their mind, right? And what is involved in that. And it was theatrics, it was like Harry Quintana, it was like people taking seats and being thrown out by the police, but being filmed, and until Max at one time told me that he was asked by Mayor Lindsay, maybe it's in the book, that if he wanted to become the commissioner that they were fighting for, and he declined because that he said wasn't the point. Yes, thought he could if he wanted, but that wasn't the point. And so they played it out all the way until the city gave in, and I can't remember his name, but there's a lawyer was the first African American there. But I think that those, to me, are just two really exciting approaches to problems that you don't normally see being resolved by organizations that follow the rules, the regular rules.
Wayne, I'm just going to ask you to sort of chime in a little bit on this, but I think one of the things that was really interesting that Roberta mentioned was the advocacy effort of trying to get change at the sort of, the concept of citizen architect has sort of popped up in my head, and I know you've done lots of public service, and so I wonder, is there potentially a connection between sort of Arch, or the idea of sort of how do you engage community as sort of an architect, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I was thinking about that very point as Roberta was speaking, because although I came along after the height of the activism of Arch, when I think about some of the conversations in graduate school, and I was part of a cadre who did both architecture and planning, many of the staff on the architecture side would say, you need to decide if you want to be the architect or the client, because they thought the joint degrees, what we were called the joint degree students, were focusing sort of too much on, sort of the community issues or the questions that would be dealt with by the client or by the public sector. And for us, that was exactly the point, that if you wait until all of the decisions are made and simply say, here's the program, design it, you've missed the opportunity to impact it. And I would say that in New York City now, particularly in Manhattan, but I think it may be citywide, there's an effort to get more architects to apply for membership on their local community boards. Because so much of what we're dealing with, whether it's zoning or massive replanning or looking at particular developments, you're dealing with the field of architecture and construction, which we understand. And as I said, I was drafted. I didn't volunteer. I was drafted to be chair of Land Use and Community Board 12. But we went through a massive rezoning in Inwood. I think we had meetings once a month for 18 months to talk about that. And if you don't understand what city planning is talking about, what EDC is talking about, then how do you, realistically impact or articulate what it is you want to happen or not happen with this plan that will have impacts for years to come? So I think the citizen architect is something that is critical. And I was talking yesterday with some of my colleagues about how the profession needs to maybe acknowledge or raise up the citizen architect a bit more than it does, sort of the traditional practice. I designed this building, I designed that building, I designed that building. But working with community-based organizations, working, with community boards to help them to articulate what it is that works or doesn't work for community, and in fact to help to flesh out what are the different aspects of community, because community is never singular, and you find that at the community board in your first meeting, there are different voices advocating or arguing or yelling at you for different things, and how you take that and condense it into a program that works, I think is critical.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the sustainability of the model related to community design centers. And so Melvin, you mentioned you had 2 MJQ, right? So sort of wanted to, in that context or in the context of Arch or in the context of sort of your knowledge of other efforts that have sort of followed that sort of community design center path, what do we think about, is the model sustainable, right? You can think about factors such as location, politics, economics, but what are some of the challenges, opportunities? What do we think about this sort of model as a whole?
Well, sometimes we have to go back a little further and a little deeper into history to understand that a lot of what we're talking about today, there are many precedents, and they didn't just start because in this particular case, again, I want to make your point. I want to go back to Bond himself. Got to go a little deeper behind the man. Now, Brian Goldstein, of course, has done the definitive book on not just from Harlem and Arch, and of course, a lot more is going to come out. A lot more is going to come out on Max. But the thing about Max is that his precedent was again Howard University and Hilliard Robinson back in the 1930, 1940s, when he was setting up the architecture school at Howard. And at that time that he was doing that, his office was just short walk away from the campus. It was on U Street, and his office functioned really as a teaching office for architects, for black architects, in the same sense that I found that it was existing at Harvard in terms of the whole Gropius situation. But it's very important that we understand so much of what was already happening and this relationship between Bond and Arch and the Arch model and the precedents that have gone on at Howard University. Incidentally, in 1972, Max actually threw his hat in the ring to become the dean of the School of Architecture at Howard. So he for all sorts of obvious reasons, he knew and understood the historic black college connections. Parents, and so all of those things were there. So I'm saying all this and trying to say that none of this is new. We've got to know and understand our history, and we've got to know to the extent that Max was coming from a position of history and understanding history and what the real important precedents were, all the way back. I'm dealing with a student presentation. That was a wonderful presentation, but he said something to the effect that when the Harlem Renaissance was started, and he talked about boys and all that. The fact of the matter is, the Harlem Renaissance was quarterbacked from Howard University's campus by Elaine Locke, a Howard University professor. Literally was quarterbacked from the campus, commuting. So these ties and these precedents are very, very, very strong. And I don't think, in the short run right now, a lot of things are going on that can be very discouraging. But in the long run, I think the Arch model and how it is a precedent for, I see really, it was a community design center. That community design center idea is really the Community Development Corporation Center, and what it's doing, and I think was, I don't think that that's going to be stopped. At least I hope it does, and I hope that that's accelerated. But it's all grounded in Max and Arch, and Max is well grounded in historically black college and university experience.
I am so glad you brought that up, and I'm going to go slightly off record, but I had an opportunity to visit Tuskegee University this summer, and what I didn't know was, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know better than me, but Max's dad was at Tuskegee, and that means that Max Bond as a child was walking that campus. And if you don't know the history of Tuskegee University, it's very fascinating, but the students built the campus.
And it created black architects.
Yes, so it's a really interesting, yeah, you're right, it's Arch, but there's predecessors before that. And the importance of the HBCUs and a lot of what was happening at the time out of necessity, right? They needed to build the campus, right? They didn't have other people to build the campus, so they did it out of necessity, but it also allowed them to gain skills along the way that made them more, it provided a career path. So I think that there's definitely lessons to be learned from that model that we're picking up on today.
And if I could add, the necessity to build the campus, sometimes not exactly. The head of Tuskegee was actually, when the big important white philanthropists were throwing money at him, they always also wanted to give their favorite white architect, and he resisted. He said, no, we've got some ideas about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So thank you for tying that together.
Just one little thing. in doing some research, Max, one of the things I found was letters between him and Hilliard Robinson, and one of them was when he was just coming back from Africa, and so he's thinking about working with Hilliard Robinson in D.C. And it's interesting to think, like, what would we be talking about if he had done that, had taken that job? Would he have ever left? But it was just.
No, he would have been the leader of architecture.
Yes, I know, but I'm saying, would he have been the leader that we needed
Here in
Arch
our city.
when we needed him?
The point is well taken, the connection, the interaction. Arch, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Howard University, and the HBCUs, like that.
Great. I'm going to shift over, because I'm realizing, wow, that one took a lot of time. I guess the next question I have, this is sort of a tricky one, is about language and how we define community. And so, given the diverse interpretations of community, how do you think organizations effectively can engage and organize communities that may not yet see themselves as sort of cohesive? Maybe if you can share examples from Arch, or maybe other direct actions that you may be familiar with in your own practice.
So I also want to answer the sustainability question, but maybe I'll pause. I think it's evocative and symbolic that essentially Arch's first action under Hatch was to organize one of the first Head Start preschools in the country, which was on 116th Street and now Frederick Douglass Boulevard in West Harlem. And that helped give rise to the West Harlem Community Organization, which is a very important entity in the work they did in West Harlem. I think it's also, on that subject, it's important not to forget that this organization would not have been possible without the grassroots action of a number of Black women who were deeply engaged in community organizing in their neighborhoods. Margaret McNeil was the force in West Harlem that they worked closely with Alice Cornegay in East Harlem Triangle, who is just an amazing person who was, without Alice Cornegay, Arch would not have succeeded at any of their work there. Arch in this way comes out of the community organizing tradition that is developing in the years right before it in the South, in work of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, in Mississippi around voting. The idea that you would organize an architecture effort in a preschool may seem slightly odd, but of course that's the ground in which you bring people together, they meet each other, they talk about their common concerns. Also, I think, as Hatch's image reminds us that Arch was a multiracial political coalition. That's something that becomes more complicated and problematic by the late 60s, and Arch, I think, navigates Black power pretty well. But it's the fact that you have a number of different people who found inspiration in the model, who come to it, and then out of it, certainly in 2MJQ is one example, but the Newark Area Planning Association in Newark. There's, I used to teach at the University of New Mexico. The Community Design Center there starts in 1969, and that's largely kind of working in self-described Hispanic communities in Albuquerque. These are all groups that come out of Arch directly and indirectly because they see themselves in it, and it's the idea that, of course, Blackness is essential to Arch's self-definition by the late 60s, but it's not there at the beginning. It's really about a kind of idea of a multiracial political coalition. And let's not forget, Max Bond is Max Bond, but Max Bond is the director of Arch starting in '67 because he went to Harvard with Richard Hatch and Jack Bailey, who were and Ken Simmons. So they come out of an elite world of very, very skillful young architects, and it's the fact that they know each other that makes that social network possible. In terms of sustainability, I won't go on, but I'll just ask one question, which I think is worth asking, is, was Arch ever sustainable? I'm not so sure that it was. I think, it lasted for 10 years. The last few years were not good years, And Richard Hatch told me, it effectively started because Stephen Currier, who died soon after in a plane crash, but was from a very affluent family and ran something called the Taconic Foundation, basically opened a drawer and handed him a bunch of cash. So, that maybe is a reminder that these groups, sustainability may not be the way we can measure them, but of course that doesn't mean that they weren't really important for a long time.
The sustainability question is something that I think deserves a lot of attention, but going back to the issue of defining community or bringing community together, I mean, that is something that is challenging. It can be problematic. I mean, you can hear in public discussions comments about what the community wants or the community needs, but as you dig into some of the conversations, you will often find that community can be a bit balkanized. There are different voices, different groups that on the surface may say they agree. When you get into the actual details, there are real differences. In some cases, those differences are driven by misunderstandings. I know that at Community Board 12, through the various committees, there are lots of efforts made to point out common issues, common problems that folks may think that they have, but their neighbors don't, or folks who live in this part of the community have the problem, but folks that live in that part of the community don't understand. And in many cases, that is not the case, but it is an initial task to cut through some of that balkanization. And in other cases, the balkanization is real. I mean, you can have, in Manhattan, just because you have a geographic district and you say this is Community Board X, it doesn't mean that you have people who share common interest. And in some cases, depending upon who is controlling that community board and who is the voice of that community board, they may in fact be ignoring the interests or concerns of their neighbors. So community is a challenging concept. It sounds great, and it should be something that's good, but I will tell you that listening to some of the side conversations, because folks will get up and they'll say the wonderful things, or why they want something to happen or not happen. When you hear some of the side comments, it's interesting for someone to say that I never see that person in my part of the community, or you're only saying that's good because it's over there, but if we were to put it in your neighborhood or your part, you wouldn't support that. And I've lived in the community for X number of decades, but I've never been 2 blocks over to where that project is. So folks can be very balkanized in what they consider to be community, and community board becomes a much larger thing, or even neighborhood becomes a much larger thing, because folks may look at their block or a couple of blocks as being what they consider community, and they don't have a broader interest in what's going on elsewhere. And it's, in many cases, important to point out that what is impacting someone over there has an impact on you. If not immediately, the way a policy is written or the way a law is implemented means it can have a future impact on you. And community needs to be more mindful of the broader whole and not just sort of myopic interest.
Yeah, on the sustainability issue, Arch as a community design center was certainly not sustainable. But what evolved from the community design center, which I call, for lack of something better or more elegant, the Community Development Corporation, or the Community Development Center, is not only sustainable, but it's the way, it's the direction. So we have to remember, Max was both an educator and he was an entrepreneur practitioner, and so he was bent on bending architecture to the needs of his people. Max was an integrationist, but he was a black integrationist. That didn't mean he wasn't separatist in terms of the black and white issues, nothing remotely to that effect. But he was about integrating with the poor, the downtrodden, and the afflicted with his class of the elites, if you want to think about them that way, but simply people who were educated and who had skills. He was about that integration, and so that's kind of how I see and think of the sustainability issue.
I mean, it's interesting to think about community development corporations as being, the children, so to speak, of Arch, because if you look at, an organization like the Community League of the Heights, which has been around, I think, for 72 years, it started out with a smaller mission, but if you look at cloth today, whatever the community needs, it sets out to do. So if you need a food pantry, if you need a school, if you need housing. So it's really looking at, at a very grassroots level, what does the community need? And not find someone else to do it, but to find the resources so that you can deliver that. It's not the same, approach as having the architects as directly involved, and I think that's something we need to look at how, the Bond Center and others can, continue to cultivate a pipeline of, practitioners of color who see architecture and planning, as a career goal. I mean, I sort of fell into it. I mean, believe it or not, in junior high school, we had mechanical drafting, and then I went to the High School of Art and Design, where the first year you took every major the school offered, one of which was architecture, and then for the next 2 years, you majored in something like you were in college. So I did architecture in high school, and then went on to do it in college. But if community development corporations had sort of an education component that plugged into schools and raised the visibility of architecture and planning, as an option for folks, I think that would be a good addition to what they do. But to some extent, it is interesting to look at community development corporations as the children of Arch and of community design centers.
From the standpoint of someone who who wasn't really around at that time, what I understood about the design centers and how they worked, basically when I see what was available when I started practicing, I thought that based on the description that HUDC was very close.
I never looked at them.
I thought that was like because that organization, although it was like a government thing, it still had the spirit of what I imagined the design centers that we're talking about today had, and that you could feel that you were doing something for a community, that the people's voices were heard. Usually before you got the project, but sometimes after you got the project. And I think that was one of the creations that I thought, if it didn't come from our earlier model, it certainly must have been based on it in terms of, number one, identifying problems in a community. And I worked on many of those projects that were projects that no one else would have touched if it had not been for HUDC. And so I think that there are other different ways of reshaping how that comes about. And I also worked on the community planning group, and I was in the housing and the development section for Community Board 10. And what I realized there was that sometimes it depended on the strength of the people who took over, like what was her name, Maureen Clark Smith. For those of you who were there, was a person who was a self-made leader who ran the Community Board 10, as if it had a purpose, and she wasn't going to let it get away. And the purpose was to serve people to serve the community. And I think that when you think that it's possible, because not all community boards work the same way, but when it is possible to do that, there are community boards who make those changes and who stand up for the community in that way, and that's important too. And I also saw Abyssinia Development Corporation as an important entity in terms of how do you replace something that used to be something else. But it was good in that it also developed projects that related to the community and represented the community to the degree that I think was necessary.
Yeah. So I think Roberta made an interesting point about Harlem Urban Development Corporation, which is different from Harlem Community Development Corporation. And, you know, HUDC, which I never worked for, although I did send them my resume. But I mean, they had development, they had basically an in-house architecture department, they had real estate, property management, and, you know, students from City College, many of them had an opportunity to get jobs there. But you also had a friendly or friendlier state government, HUDC being a state entity, part of the Urban Development Corporation, and the idea that you needed a Harlem-based organization to deal with development issues in Harlem was something, I guess, that was part of the context of the time. But if you have a change at the state level that takes HUDC and dissolves it and reduces it to an agency that is maybe a third the size, which is Harlem Community Development Corporation, which I worked for, we still had the people in Harlem, and I remember a few of the people who worked at HUDC, who still worked at Harlem CDC, that the folks downtown in the parent corporation don't really understand what it is we're trying to do uptown. But that goes to the issue of sustainability. I mean, if someone has the ability to pull the rug out from under you, it can and does weaken your ability to advance your agenda. However, as Roberta said, if you have people who are committed to the agenda, you will take the lemons and try to make lemonade out of it.
Just to make the link clear, HUDC is a direct outgrowth of the state office building protests, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about in our third panel. I also think it's one of many parables, as is Abyssinian Development Corporation, as is Arch itself, about the difficult road these kinds of organizations follow, and also the inability to define a monolithic community. At HUDC's inception, there was a much more radical vision of Harlem that was on the table, and kind of, even though folks like Alice Cornegay were involved in HUDC, the kind of ministers and that entity of Harlem become kind of the largest force behind HUDC, and it diverges at that point. It's not to say that it's not impactful, because it was, but it takes a very different approach to Harlem's development as a result of that. There's a much more commercial in orientation than what Arch was arguing for. So, you know, I think Harlem Commonwealth Council, there's a lot of H blank blank blanks. Yeah, HCC has a somewhat similar path, and I think some of that is, you know, people's personalities and the frailties of a human being, but a lot of it is also the reality of working in a capitalist system in which you do need to do something that makes income, or you cease to exist. And certainly by Arch's end, you know, it's becoming more like an architecture firm, and you know, I think anyone here with any kind of foot in the world of community design centers knows well the sort of tension between, you know, do I keep applying for grants and get nothing done, or do I become a fee-for-service organization and essentially become just a firm? And it's really hard to walk that line in a way that isn't going to somewhat determine what you do. You know, I think at the moment we have organizations like Mellon who have somewhat taken the mantle of groups like Ford Foundation in Arch's day, but you know, they change their priorities, and then what happens next? And certainly Arch was forced to navigate those, as all of these groups have.
Okay, great. So I had a few more questions, but I think we're running on time to be able to allow for questions from the audience. So I would say, before we get to questions from the audience, which is coming really, really soon, I'm going to fold the last question into sort of a final remarks if you have any last thing to say, right? So one, and I think we have actually touched on this, so feel free to spin your response however you'd like. But given the recent resurgence of interest in community design, so it's sort of, we're talking about it a lot more, and the challenges faced by well-known centers, we sort of heard a little bit about the closing of Hester Street, and there's others. Sort of what do you think success in community design looks like? You know, maybe here in Harlem, communities of color, other neighborhoods you might be familiar with, and then sort of what your final thoughts might be on what just urban futures look like within community design, and how do we ensure that these designs promote equity and inclusivity in our communities moving forward. So however you'd like to sort of take that as sort of your last few remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions. And does anybody want to start, or I can call on people too. I can also.
Well, it's a tough question to answer in a sense, because looking at just futures, to me, it is having the ability to truly engage with community stakeholders, to discuss in depth the issue or issues that you want to advance, and to shape a policy approach for how you want it to advance. The problem then is ensuring that it is implemented. And if you don't know, community boards are advisory. So, for example, if we are charged by both the Department of City Planning and the Economic Development Corporation to do a deep dive into the inward rezoning and to give detailed responses to how we would not only like to see the rezoning shaped, but also other economic investments that would go along with that, and you put together the equivalent of a 12-page policy paper, which is the resolution that is passed by the community board and one of the land use staff at the city council. It's one of the best resolutions they've ever seen dealing with the issue, that then doesn't get implemented. Right. So the resolution/policy paper may outline a vision for a just future, but it's in someone else's hands to take that recommendation and make it real.
Well,
Can you use the microphone?
I think the problem is Community Design Center. I've just got a huge problem with the word design, not in the sense that it isn't something that's real and something that has to be considered, but design implies a lot of things, and one of the things that we know, for instance, you mentioned the trying to transition from Community Design Center to people services. In both cases, the level of financial naivete, financial unsophistication, and lack of the right kind of type of skills dooms both of those propositions. And so that's why I'm kind of stuck on, we've got to move this thing towards community development centers. And you could also even add the word research, community research and development, and centering it on the university or connecting it with the university. So I'm still at the point of believing that we're in the process now of a course correction, so to speak, a sort of predict as well as advocate an already ongoing course correction in which there are a lot of things that just weren't possible to be done for communities, or certainly black communities, and to a certain extent Latin communities, to be done prior to the 64, 65 Civil Rights Act. And we're just now getting around to really understanding what can be done given those two. Now, if those two things can hold, and I think that despite today's situation, there's a bright future. But bottom line is, you gotta harness, come to terms with this word design and how it's throwing things off, especially in today's time, and in information technology, artificial intelligence, et cetera, and so on. All of that easily fits and can work in the Community Development Corporation context. Okay, I'm going to just let it go with that.
Thank you. That was great. Brian or Roberta?
Do you want to, maybe, should we do audience? And
Yeah, we can do audio. Yes, we'll shift that. I cannot see because the light is in my, I can get up and, oh, somebody's passing the mic. Fantastic, thank you.
So this is for Mr. Benjamin. So as a person who has been through that process with community boards of spending months planning a community rezoning plan or a community development plan, which is just advisory, do you think we need to be at a point where legislatively we change the role of community boards so that the voice of the community is actually heard and is more substantially part of the decision-making process?
Legislatively, I don't know if the powers that be would be interested in doing that, because that is giving the community boards power akin to the city council and everything. But that said, one of the things that we are very mindful of is that decision-making is political. And it's not just a matter of saying, okay, this is the resolution that we've passed, but there are elected officials who represent the community. We make sure they get our resolution, but then we follow up with them saying, what are you doing to advance it? And some of the elected officials are very good about asking the community board before they vote on something, what do you think about it? I remember when there was a particular issue of creating a historic district, actually in the area where I live. Robert Jackson at the time was the city council person, and I asked him, did he support it? He said, no. Do you support it? Does the community board support it? Not every elected official necessarily takes that approach of, what do you think? But, whether it is affordable housing or rezoning or, resiliency, the decision-making is political. The community boards need to engage with the elected officials who are part of that political process. Also, if you look at some of the community benefits agreements, which are legally not enforceable. However, the city council, in their approval, they can take the community board requirements and they can put it in the legislation, and that is enforceable. With the Board of Standards and Appeals, if they're granting, a special permit, they can add those requirements to the special permit. So you need to know the political levers and to use them.
I had a question to the panelists. You talked about the role of philanthropic organizations in ARCH and its development, and then also kind of on the contemporary level, foundations and the role that they're playing. I wonder if you could speak specifically to the role of Black wealth in these Black wealth, the wealth that Black persons have, and how what is the responsibility, if you see a responsibility, and what is the accountability to those who have generated wealth either from the philanthropic side or from the for-profit side to be engaged, and what would that engagement, what should that engagement look like in your view?
This is, I'm maybe not to answer your question, but just to put a fact on the table, which I think is important to remember, which is that Darren Walker, who's been the Dynamo director of the Ford Foundation for the last 5 or 6 years, was the chief financial officer of Abyssinian in its kind of Abyssinian Development Corporation in its kind of period of most robust development in the 90s, and so I think that is maybe just another traceable line we can draw. I'm not ready to answer your question yet, but I want to at least point that out because I think it's not something that's mentioned much in the celebration of him and the work he's done, but clearly that experience shaped his view on the world and maybe somewhat answers your question in terms of him being a power player in the allocation of money and clearly influenced by that experience in ways that maybe haven't quite reverberated in terms of community development corporations and community design centers, but certainly reflect some of his priorities as a person who allocates. I think I need to think more about the question beyond that, though.
But black wealth could be used by developers who had the same philosophies that we're talking about now. It's a choice, and maybe it's something that they don't know that they have the power to do. You know, that if you have money, and if your understanding of what's required in a community is something that you're not seeing served, there's nothing, I think, to stop you from becoming a developer, but just a developer with a different vision and a heart, no? But I think that person actually has probably more possibilities to create the kind of community development, to participate in the kind of community development that they want, and that I think is sort of what we're talking about. So, I mean, I don't think you're banned from participating or figuring out how to do it just because you're wealthy. Welcome.
I can talk now? Okay. I find that in this panel, I'm here, this side, nothing has been discussed about education. I also served on a community board 15 years, chaired a number of committees. Me and Yvonne led the West 125th Street rezoning for the community board. One of the things I'm not hearing is that we need new models. Not design centers, not these community centers that you're talking about, but we need new models because average people do not understand this at all. Right. They don't know what to ask for. They don't know what the issues are. They're being placed in awkward situations where they're being told, tell us what you want, but they don't know what they want. And we need to help people understand what conditions are going on around them, which are constantly changing now due to climate change, and help them to move forward. Prime example, Tom Lunky, your former colleague, did Zoning 101 when we were dealing with the 125th Street rezoning. Over 200 people, East, Central, West Harlem, went once a week to learn about rezoning so that we could prepare for the vote for the rezoning. It didn't go exactly the way we wanted to, but at least we took the time, the effort to educate ourselves to understand it. So where do we go now when it comes to education to help average residents across New York City understand what we're dealing with? Because when January 20th comes, if you thought there was a problem, you're going to experience a real problem. No money, no support, no help. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, that was great. I want to just chime in a little bit, and then so that people can sort of think about their responses. So you are 100% correct. We did not touch on that. And it is extremely important, and that's, I think, the sort of the future, right? Not even the future, it's current, but it's really something we have to think about and figure out in the next 30 days. So maybe we can talk about that during lunch. But I will say, I have found some of the tools that the Center for Urban Pedagogy, if anybody's familiar, Center for Urban Pedagogy CUP, they have some really great tools that have been able to sort of describe some of the concepts of like ULURP or zoning. Like if you can describe it to a 5-year-old, you know, everybody can understand it, right? And the graphics are really clear, right? Because I think one of the things we can do as architects and designers is we have the ability to sort of visualize some of these things. Right, so I reference them a lot, so if anybody is not familiar, I encourage you to check them out. The other sort of related to new models is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Made in Brownsville, but which I think now is a youth design center, but there are groups doing some really interesting things. A lot of young architects coming out of school that haven't found their place, that are starting their own sort of, it's sort of like a compilation of a series of different things, and I don't think there's one specific model for it, but there's some really interesting things coming out. So maybe that is something we can provide some resources to people who've registered, like later on for people who want to find more information. But we need a lot more of that. So thank you for bringing that up. And then I don't know if anybody wants to.
Well, I think just in terms of what you're saying about the community boards, when community boards have input of architects and planners, it makes it at least something that can be explained to the entire board more easily. And there have been moves, like with the AIA, to try to encourage architects to participate, because the questions that you are maybe looking for answers to are things that relate to architects, what architects would know. And I, when I worked, when I was at the community board for like 7 or 8 years, part of what I did was to explain, before we did votes, what the options were, and to explain that we didn't have to go this way because this developer says this. And I think that when that input is missing, that's not a good situation. But I'm sure there are other ways to also do that. But it just seems that the community board is there, and that there must be a way to transmit education about the kinds of things that you're voting on that they think about.
And I have also found that a lot of the environmental justice groups in communities are doing a lot of this work. And so if we had more architects at the table with some of these environmental justice groups, I feel like there could be really amazing. Uprose did some really amazing advocacy work in Sunset Park. We Act for Environmental Justice has done a series of different things. But a lot of these environmental justice groups are mobilizing really fast. So it'd be interesting to see how they are working with or collaborating with some of the other sort of design groups to make stronger coalitions.
I might just add in terms of Arch's approach, it's true we didn't talk about education too explicitly, but I will say one of the important things about a group like Arch was that it was not, it wasn't ultimately only reactive, it wasn't reflexive, it didn't just respond to something that was given to it, it was also about projection, about giving a community the power to imagine its future, and that is a very different kind of engagement with development than just reaction or, and I think what Roberta and Wayne are describing is a process in which people are handed something and they have to react to it, and the realm of possibilities is on the table. Arch was really interested in kind of thinking on a longer term, a longer time scale, and East Harlem Triangle implemented a lot of the things in their plan. Maybe they look a little different than they imagined, but they did it. But it took 25, 30 years. It was a very long time, but having the plan was, for them, really empowering.
Yeah, but also to what Roberta said, I mean, community boards have the ability, and to some extent, if they're doing their job, actually provide that type of education that we're discussing. I mean, as I mentioned, when we did the inward rezoning, we didn't meet for 18 months just to meet. I mean, there were aspects of what the rezoning meant, what contextual zoning meant, that were discussed. Separate and apart from a specific rezoning, I mean, there are, through the borough president's office and through city planning, this kind of the, zoning 101 and advanced zoning 101 training that's given to community board members, but we've also asked for those presentations to be given at some of our committee meetings so that members of the public understand, what these terms mean and how it impacts what we're talking about so when we get to a particular project, it is not the first time that we've talked about the Board of Standards and Appeals and what it does and what we're doing. Depending upon who is in office, at the borough president's office or the city council, there is more or less attention or support to that kind of education, but the access to the information is there, and if the community board, once again, is doing its job at those monthly meetings, and we meet every month except for July and August when we're on break, that information can be shared.
I think we have, we are at time, but if Marta, do you want to take the last question?
Yeah. Firstly, I want to thank you all. This has been a pretty insightful discussion. Firstly, I want to kind of make a quick statement, and then I'll get into my question. Clearly, architecture is a very political act, right? As shown here, as your discussion kind of illustrates, the two are kind of inseparable, right? But it would seem that part of the profession distances itself from community, from politics. And my question is, moving forward, how do we kind of, I don't want to say forcefully, but bake politics or the understanding that this is kind of a very visceral thing we're working on, right? How we further improve on that understanding and just improve the situation of our communities, of our cities across the country. Not only Harlem. Harlem's kind of a good sparking ground for this, but how do we move this at a larger urban scale?
I mentioned that when I was in graduate school, there were these conversations typically coming from staff, and pointed at the dual degree students, and it was focused on what is the role of the architect. And so if the profession sees the role of the architect in the very traditional sense where you're working for a client, the client is giving you the program and you are executing their program, then you're not going to get the kind of political and community, engagement that we're talking about. If the education of architects, takes the direction, that when I was in graduate school we got from being in, both the Department of Architecture and Department of Planning, where you're looking at architecture in a much broader context. You're looking at it from a perspective of social services and from development. Then you realize that if you have what you conceive to be good design or planning ideas, if you're not at the table with the ability to push for those to be implemented, those ideas are meaningless. So I think it goes back to how architects are educated, but also how the profession embraces or doesn't embrace that sort of dual role of the architect.
Also, just, Marta, do you want to?
Yeah,
I will respond to you specifically later. I'm just letting you know.
So I did want to echo Mo's thanks for a wonderful panel, and I have many questions which I will ask, particularly about the relationship of community design centers and community development corporations and their particular history in northern Manhattan. But the question I'd like perhaps the panel to think of as a whole is, and Mr. Mitchell alluded to this in his comments, is what is the role of the university in supporting community design? And here we are at City college, right? And here we are with the J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures situated and active in our school. So where we think, we have my colleague Jack Travis from Pratt, where we know the Pratt Community Design Center has thrived for in various forms a long time. But in my role as dean, I know so much that the success of these endeavors depends on funding. So echoing Milton Curry's comment, if the university is to advance community design, where is the money going to come from? And how do we make it happen? So.
Again,
It's a plea for help.
again, I think you're going to have to, well, I don't think I'm in the atmosphere where this is going to be receptive, but you're just going to have to rethink that word design. It doesn't communicate. You're just going to have to rethink that word. But you do put your hands on the issue, and that is, and I alluded to it earlier, and that is the university, the whole university, as well as, as this architecture and planning and other entities that are dealing with the built environment. Because that lady posed a really big issue and big question. And I'm not sure that this is quite the form of being able to deal with it, but that's the only thing that really, really matters right now.
Okay, great. So I think we are at time, and we have a lunch break. I wanted to take a second to thank all the panelists. Can we give them a round of applause?